Final session of the day to Dr. Sujivani Kurukulasuriya, senior consultant in rheumatology and rehabilitation, as well as the president-elect of the College of Specialists in Rheumatology and Rehabilitation.
Right. Okay. Right. So I'm Sujivani, as you heard. So it's my pleasant duty to welcome Dr. Professor Salma Balan. She's a pediatric rheumatologist and head of department at the Department of Rheumatology and Clinical Immunology at Amritsar Institute of Medical Science, Kochi. Over to you, Dr. Balan, and she'll be enlightening us on juvenile dermatomyositis and other autoimmune disorders.
Slideshow. It isn't coming as a slide. Is it coming out? No. Sorry. Okay. So thank you. Final session of the day. And I hope I can keep you all active and focused like the other speakers were able to. So basically, we are going to talk about all other CTDs. Because, SLE is such a big topic, you can have an entire conference on it and still not finish. And the other CTDs are also important for us to know. So we have juvenile dermatomyositis, then scleroderma, where there's localized and systemic. You have Sjogren's syndrome and mixed connective tissue disease, which we will be dwelling on in this session. So the incidence of these is lower than SLE. And among all of these, juvenile dermatomyositis is the next, or the idiopathic inflammatory myositis, as the whole group is called, are the next common group of connective tissue diseases in children. And you can see that, there isn't a very, there is a little bit of gender predominance in women, girls in JDM and in localized scleroderma, but significantly more so in the juvenile systemic sclerosis group and in the Sjogren's. And the important thing is that these are all rare diseases. But as I always say, in India, just like Sri Lanka, we have populous countries with a very, very high load of children in our population. And if you're giving a disease an incidence of 1 in 1,000, you're talking about 1 million population. So they could be rare, but they are very much around. So when do you suspect these diseases? So when children come to you, so I'm sure there are a lot of pediatricians in this audience, when children come to you with prolonged fever, unexplained rashes, particularly photosensitive rashes, constitutional symptoms, other features like hair fall, oral ulcers, then certain specific features like recurrent parotitis, dry eyes, dry mouth, musculoskeletal features, and vascular features like Raynaud's phenomenon, muscle weakness, hypertension, etc., do think that one of the possibilities here could be a connective tissue disease. And if you think about it, then you will think about it more if the story turns out to be so. The idiopathic inflammatory myositis, as we call the whole group of them, there are a number of clinical syndromes within that, of which the commonest is juvenile dermatomyositis, where you have skin and muscle being significantly involved. 85% of IIM in children is juvenile dermatomyositis. And next is overlap, where there's an overlap between myositis and another connective tissue disease, and then only the others come in. So amyopathic means that they have the features, all the cutaneous features, but there is no muscle weakness that you can ascertain. Hypomyopathic means mild muscle weakness, and necrotizing myositis is a different entity. So when would you recognize juvenile dermatomyositis? So it's probably not missed when they come with a classic skin and the muscle symptom, the proximal muscle weakness together, along with high muscle enzymes. But will you pick it up in a child with a PUO? who may even have a macrophage activation that we were discussing this morning. Will you pick it up in an irritable toddler who has cutaneous features but may not be exactly those cutaneous features that you're finding in dermatomyositis? Will you pick it up in a young toddler who has alopecia as the first presentation and then develops progressive weakness? Will you recognize dermatomyositis in a child who has raised liver enzymes, who keeps going to gastroenterologists? Remember that SGOT and SGPT are not only from the liver, they are also from the muscle. So sometimes elevated SGOT, SGPT, in the absence of a liver disease, you need to think whether it could be a muscle disease. And children who come with anasarca, you can't find a cardiac or a renal cause for it. Please think, look at their muscle enzymes. This could be the first presentation of dermatomyositis. And children who come with the consequences of disease, with delayed presentation, with contractures, calcinosis, lipodystrophy, etc. So there are a lot of skin lesions in JDM. We'll see those in a minute. And there are the majority of the diseases indicate active disease, but some of them can indicate both active and damage. So some of these are here. So the first one here you can see is a very strong heliotrope rash with periorbital puffiness. The child below, toddlers can have variable rashes. So this child has heliotrope plus a disseminated kind of photosensitive rash that is there. You can see here, this is the V sign, the shawl sign, the holster sign. There are so many signs described, and this child demonstrates all of them. And this is the shawl sign at the back where you can see, it's basically depends. These are all photosensitive rashes. And you can have extensive rashes in these patients. And when these patients come with these, especially when children come with proximal muscle weakness alone, there could be a good number of differential diagnoses. So a number of neuromuscular diseases, myopathies, myotonic dystrophy, all these, and even infective myositis, etc., can enter your differential diagnosis. And this group is particularly important to think about when your patient has no cutaneous manifestations. When there are cutaneous manifestations and the proximal muscle weakness, it's less of a differential diagnosis. We just had a child about a month ago who presented with weakness and progressive pharyngeal weakness at a different hospital. They thought initially she had Guillain-Barré, though her CPK was 23,000. And she was given IVIG thinking it's Guillain-Barré. Then she got ventilated. She seemed to get better, but then they shifted her to us. And our pediatric neurologist, naturally, she had no skin lesions at all. We sent a tandem mass spectroscopy, which was negative. But then they wanted to treat her as polymyositis. I said, we have to biopsy this child. We rarely do muscle biopsies these days. Said, we have to biopsy this child because I'm not entirely sure that this is the diagnosis. It was interesting because she was started on a metabolic cocktail as well as steroids. At the same time, she made dramatic improvement, came off the ventilator, progressing well, and then finally we get the TMS negative, but the muscle biopsy comes back suggestive of glutaric acid urea type 2. And so, these things can surprise you from time to time. The skin disease of dermatomyositis you can have psoriasiform rashes in some patients, and it can be mistaken for psoriasis. It can be mistaken for eczema as well. So that's why they may not always be very, very typical. If you have the heliotrope and the Gautrons, there's very, very little likelihood that it's something else. So to make a diagnosis, in 1975, the first criteria came out, the Bohan and Peter diagnostic criteria, which said the presence of the classic rash, heliotrope, periorbital edema, Gautrons papules, the presence of symmetrical proximal muscle weakness, and either muscle biopsy evidence of myositis or elevated muscle enzymes or EMG showing the triad of myopathy. Now, when we say elevated muscle enzymes, everybody thinks CPK. There are 5 muscle enzymes that you must check in every patient when you make a diagnosis: CPK, LDH, ALT, AST, aldolase. Of these, aldolase is the most muscle specific. Okay? And LDH can come from bone, sometimes from liver, as well as from muscle. And CPK may not be elevated in all patients with dermatomyositis. We have at least about 20 to 30% of patients where it is not elevated. It could be one of the other muscle enzymes that is elevated, and that's important to know, because to follow up, you need to know which enzyme to follow up on. Now, there was a diagnosis of how you make definitive, probable, and possible JDM based on the Bohannon-Peter criteria. But as we started knowing a little more about the pathology, these criteria got revised in 2006. And so they looked at the skin rash, muscle weakness, and elevated muscle enzymes, and with additional criteria where biopsy or EMG or muscle MRI or nail fold capillaroscopy, calcinosis, presence of dysphonia also played into making a diagnosis. Now, what are the measures? How do we know whether the disease is active or not? So we have clinical scales. This is freely downloadable, the Childhood Myositis Assessment Scale. It's a series of maneuvers that you make the child do, and you can actually assess the muscle score. It takes into all the domains into account, and it's a beautiful score to follow up the child on. MMT8 is another such tool, and then you have for cutaneous disease, you have the cutaneous assessment tool. Regarding muscle enzymes, they're very useful in the beginning of diagnosis and to make sure it's coming down. But in the long term, you may not have elevated muscle enzymes at all. You cannot use them to follow up the patient long term. The pathogenesis of JDM is primarily a small vessel vasculitis in the initial phase, which is largely cytokine mediated, and later it becomes a proper vasculopathy with capillary dropout, and there is also a huge type 1 interferon signature in these patients. And these are important things that we've learned now, which modify the way we approach these patients therapeutically. So the important thing is, this is not just a muscle and skin disease. It is a systemic vasculopathy. And it's not only the muscle and skin that are involved. These patients can have constitutional symptoms. They can have arthritis, particularly small joint. There are varieties that can have significant ILD, which might be the death knell for these patients. You can have severe GI disease, which is a feature of the vasculopathy. You can even have, I have lost a patient to pancreatitis, which is a rare manifestation. You can have myocarditis or pulmonary hypertension, which can be again very severe complications, and very rarely CNS disease in these patients. And investigations wise, all the muscle enzymes to be done, and do remember, normal enzymes do not rule out, especially if the child is presenting to you slightly later in the course of disease. An MRI is very, very useful. You don't need contrast. The stir sequences showing the edema both in the muscle as well as in the skin can help you make a diagnosis of the myositis. Please remember, this is not specific for IIM. You may get similar changes in other myopathies also. It's the total context that is important. And for places who have dedicated ultrasound experts who can actually describe these findings on ultrasound, ultrasound itself can make a good diagnostic modality. Then what is increasing now is we do nail fold capillaroscopy. It tells us about the degree of vasculopathy in these patients, which helps us modify their treatment and prognosticate as well significantly. What about autoantibodies? About 80% of them can have positive ANAs, but more important than the ANA are the myositis-specific and the myositis-associated antibodies. Today, we have clinical phenotypes of dermatomyositis completely based on the antibody profile. And this helps us again know, describe, characterize the phenotype, and we learn to actually look at these patients differently. So with this antibody, these are the problems I expect with this patient. We'll come to that in a minute. Muscle biopsy itself, we do it in, other than research centers, we generally, because it's an invasive disease in an already weak child, we would prefer to do muscle biopsy when there are atypical cases, when there are no skin changes or skin without muscle involvement. When you're not really sure about what's going on is when you want to do a muscle biopsy. If you have enough clues from the rest of the child, you don't need to do a muscle biopsy. And this is what the MRI looks like. You can see active muscle inflammation and edema in the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. And usually the thigh is the best place to do the MRI. If you want to biopsy the patient, MRI also helps you pick the right site for biopsy. So over time, from Bohan and Peter time, we have seen a lot of change in the way we understand juvenile idiopathic inflammatory myositis. Over time, we've learned that this is a disease beyond the skin and the muscle. Many other organs are involved. We have learned how to characterize separate syndromes of this disease based on the myositis antibodies and the myositis specific and the associated antibodies. We have learned that there are many more pathogenic processes in these patients, the vasculopathy and the type 1 interferonopathy that these patients have. With that, we look at a little bit more about these diseases. And this is what you do. You can use a dermoscope, you can use an ophthalmoscope with a suitable medium, and you can learn to do, it's very standard now in our clinic. Any patient with a dermatomyositis gets a nail fold capillaroscopy. Same for most connective tissue diseases, we do a nail fold capillaroscopy. It helps us understand the degree of vasculopathy that is present in these patients. And these are the kind of findings you can get, the way the capillaries look in these patients. What is interesting is that when you reach to this kind of stage where you have some capillary dropout and you have large tortuous capillaries, then you know that most of the time when you have a vasculopathy that you can see in the nail fold capillaroscopy, it is approximated to the level that you can assume that there is GI vasculopathy in these patients. That means that giving oral drugs at that time may not be effective. It is better to give your drugs parenterally in the initial phase. How are they different, adult and the pediatric disease? So adult disease is more common compared to the pediatric disease. And the adult diseases are more typical in their presentations, whereas pediatric diseases, you can have quite a few atypical presentations, a lot more skin ulceration. The muscle enzyme is more predictable in the adult compared to the pediatric. The nature, the clinical syndromes are different in the adults. They see more of polymyositis, they see more of amyopathic DM compared to us seeing a lot of dermatomyositis. The risk of malignancy is much higher in the adult population, whereas in children it is negligible. I am yet to come across a single case even of malignancy associated with JDM. The risk of interstitial lung disease is much higher in the adult population. Calcinosis is much higher in the pediatric population. And the MSAs in the adult population, they actually prognosticate for cancer risk, whereas the relevance of the clinical, the clinical prognostication in children is very different with the MSAs compared to what you see in adults. The vasculopathy is also much more common in dermatomyositis in children compared to adults. So I've been talking a lot about these clinical phenotypes. What does it mean? So this is what you see in children according to pathology. So you have dermatomyositis, polymyositis, overlap myositis, and amyopathic JDM. As I said before, the most common type you see in children is dermatomyositis, where they have rash and muscle involvement, particularly proximal weakness. They can present as edema, they can present as vasculopathy, they can present as calcinosis. The next common is the overlap, where you can have features of another connective tissue disease plus JDM. Then you have the polymyositis, which is a very small group, 4 to 8%, where there is absolutely no skin involvement. And these patients can also have, a high muscle enzymes with proximal and distal myositis and Raynaud's phenomenon, cardiac involvement, etc. This group will almost always need a muscle biopsy for diagnosis. And then the clinically amyopathic, in pediatric age group, amyopathic dermatitis may not be a very bad thing to have in a good number of cases. You call it amyopathic if you have followed them up for at least 6 months and you see no clinical evidence of muscle involvement, including an MRI. You may get very mild muscle enzyme elevations though in these patients. They're still prone to the vasculopathy. They can still develop calcinosis, and they can still sometimes be associated with lung disease. So this is the clinico-pathological syndromes that you can get. Next, we look at the autoantibody phenotypes. And this is what is really useful. These days, this is what we do with these patients. We look at every patient, we look at the myositis specific and the myositis associated antibodies, so we understand better how these patients are going to progress. So from Western literature, the commonest is the anti-P155, which is a TIF1 gamma antibody. And these patients have very severe cutaneous disease with ulceration, and they can progress to lipodystrophy and metabolic disease. Sometimes it can be amyopathic, and it's often a chronic polycyclic course with these patients. The next common is the NXP2 or the anti-MJ, and these patients have severe muscle weakness. They do have significant skin changes, but they develop calcinosis and contractures very, very significantly. Again, it's a chronic persistent course. Then the next common is the anti-MDA5. Interestingly, in the Oriental group of patients, this is the commonest phenotype that is seen. In fact, I ran a crude survey amongst my colleagues about a year ago, and we found that NXP2 and MDA5 were neck to neck in being the commonest types in India among the various different centers, in opposition to what is seen in the Western world. And the important thing about anti-MDA5 is the muscle weakness can be significantly lower. They may even be amyopathic, but they can have cutaneous changes, including ulcers, and quite a high predisposition to lung disease, particularly rapidly progressive interstitial lung disease, which can be fatal in these patients. And then, not that common, but probably the best outcome overall is the anti-MI2 patients who develop classic JDM that you've read in all your pediatric textbooks. Having said that, you can have very severe disease in these patients, but you treat them, and this is the group who are likely to have monocyclic disease and completely come off treatment and remain very well for life. So this is an important group to recognize. There are other antibodies, the anti-synthetase, anti-SRP, etc., which are not very common in children, so I'm not going to go into a great detail about them. Then we have the overlap group, where the antibodies you see are the anti-Rho52 or the anti-PMSCL and the anti-U1RMP, and they have the clinical features that go with the connective tissue disease that is described with these antibodies. And we'll come to that as well as we go on in the session today. The important thing about this group of patients is that there's a higher risk of ILD in these patients, and perhaps even in some of them for pulmonary hypertension. So we look at how these patients look. So this is an anti-TIF1 gamma boy. Sadly, these photos are a little bit after treatment. I don't have his early photos. And however, you can make out that he has developed lipodystrophy. And that is something that is significantly, so he actually had very bad skin ulcerative disease when he came to us. He has lipodystrophy. You can see the hollowing on his face and even on his chest wall. He has had ulcers which have healed, and you can see even here this forearm, etc. You can see the old gotrons and other features that he had. This is another child who had a TIF1 gamma, and you can see how she has gone on. She's much older now. She's had amyopathic disease, but she has significant metabolic disease with severe lipodystrophy. You can see in the thighs, the wasting. You can see the persistence of some of the cutaneous symptoms. She came to us probably 10 years after onset of disease. This is anti-NXP2, where, as I told you, they have very severe weakness, but they go on to develop significant calcinosis. You can see the calcinotic lesions and the ulcers they cause as a result, how troublesome, how difficult they can be. See the kind of heliotrope rash this boy had. And here you also have something called cutaneous overgrowth. If you can look carefully at this picture, at the nail bed, you can see the cuticular overgrowth at the edges of the nails, which is sometimes another skin feature that you can see in these patients. You can see the Gauthron's papules, the old Gauthron's papules. You can see the large calcinotic lesions. Here at the elbows, you can see the calcinotic lesions that are there. And this boy was just hardly 3 weeks into the disease, and he's already developed contractures of the tendoachilles. That is the nature of anti-NXP2. And this is the anti-MDA5. So this, what you can see, is the inverse Gauthrons that this child, and that is something that you see in this group of patients. You can see the heliotrope, you can see the V sign, you can see the alopecia, and you can see the clubbing that she has. She has ILD. She did very well with very aggressive immunosuppression, but you have to recognize this, and then you have to make sure that you get the good systemic evaluation for these patients so that you can treat the systemic disease very aggressively. She hardly had much of muscle weakness. That doesn't mean that her disease is mild, because her severity of disease is in the lung. And this is a little girl with MI2A. She came to us very, very irritable toddler. They didn't really know what was wrong with her. And you can see that she has a lot of the heliotrope, the Gauthrons, the malar rash. The malar rash is different from lupus in that in lupus the nasolabial fold is often spared. Here it is continuous with that. You can see the V sign, the extensive cutaneous lesions, the Gauthrons, etc. that this child has. She has done extremely well. She has the predicted monocyclic course. This was a very interesting child who actually came to us with history of, she was referred by a pediatrician to a pediatric cardiologist for pulmonary hypertension, diagnosed on an echo because she was complaining of dyspnea and exertion. Because he did not find, he wanted me to have a look to see if there were any rheumatological causes for PAH, and sent the child. And we saw here old Gautron's papules. So we did an MSA which showed a strong Rho positivity. And this is the overlap myositis. She was treated with pulmonary with anti-PDE5 antagonists as well as with mycophenolate mofetil. She's done extremely well, and she's off her sildenafil completely now. So treatment is decided by many things. What is the severity of disease? What all involvement is there? What systemic organ involvement is there? What is the disease phenotype? These diseases are rare. It is best that these patients are referred to a particular center that manages these patients regularly so that they can be managed the best way. And these are the guidelines that we have to help treat these patients. So severity of disease is described based on each system. And when you see a patient at diagnosis, you not only make a diagnosis, you try to think what clinical phenotype and what is the severity of disease for these patients. And there are three things at the point of diagnosis. It's not only medications are the most important part, but exercise therapy, maintaining good range of movement, otherwise you'll get early contractures. And adjunctive therapy like calcium and vitamin D, sunblock, then topical tacrolimus for the skin, etc. can also be considered. But medications wise, first line therapy, if your patient is severe disease, that's a different process. If it's mild to moderate disease, you would think of corticosteroids, high dose with methotrexate, and subcutaneous is what we prefer because of the almost concomitant GI vasculopathy that is present in these patients. You can subsequently change them to oral, but subcutaneous methotrexate is definitely better in these patients compared to oral. For severe disease, we would think upfront about using aggressive immunosuppression, corticosteroids with cyclophosphamide, IVIG, perhaps even drugs like rituximab. And if you have the lung disease, you may think early about calcineurin inhibitors or JAK inhibitors based on the other diseases that you have. And if the patient's not responding to therapy, then many of the other systemic immunosuppressants come into play. You may need to change the treatments that you think of. The other big problem we encounter, calcinosis. And calcinosis is something that the more you leave the disease untreated, the higher the risk of it. Of course, there are certain clinical phenotypes which are more prone for calcinosis, like the anti-NXP2. And if the presence of nail fold abnormalities at baseline also give a higher risk, chronic disease scores, the presence of joint contractures, etc. So the thing I can tell you about calcinosis is that it's easier prevented than treated. So early aggressive therapy using steroids with subcutaneous methotrexate upfront will definitely reduce the risk of future calcinosis compared to using only steroids to treat these patients. And we have tried everything but the kitchen sink literally in treating these patients, and nothing is consistently that effective. Recently, we are having some success with tofacitinib. And this is one boy who came to me 3 years after the diagnosis of JDM. He had some weakness. He was anti-NXP2. But after we got his disease into remission, he developed this massive calcinotic lesion in the spectral region. We tried various treatments. We even tried JAK inhibition at that time. It wasn't that effective. We actually sent him, this lower down picture is just pre-surgery. We finally decided to do a surgical excision of this lesion. But after surgical excision, it came back. You can see in the third picture that it has actually come back. At this point, when we gave him JAK inhibition, he completely resolved, and he's doing very well now. So hopefully this might be something that we can try earlier. Being a rare disease, we don't have very, very robust evidence. It's very difficult to do RCTs in these patients. So we have only few RCTs. A lot of the thing is case and cohort studies. And most of our treatments for calcinosis, for instance, are all based on just case series and case reports. So we need a lot more evidence, a lot more robust treatments to help these patients. And we rarely use azathioprine in juvenile dermatomyositis. I know that adult disease it is used, but it has very, very little effect in pediatric patients. As I said earlier, the prognosis, 25% have a monocyclic course, 25% have a polyphasic course, and 50% overall have a chronic course. And muscle atrophy, contractures, calcinosis, metabolic disease, these are all long-term outcomes that make us sit up and realize what a significant disease this is and why we should be aggressive early, both in diagnosing and treating this condition. And the same thing again. And previously, the mortality was about 30%. In developed nations today, it's less than 4%. In other cohorts, it's 5 to 8%. But there are a lot of complications, a lot of sequelae, and we need to improve the way we are managing these patients to get them better in the long term. We'll move to the next one now, pediatric scleroderma. So there are two types of scleroderma. You have the systemic and the localized. Thankfully, what is more common in children is the localized rather than the systemic. The localized is considered to be a cutaneous disease, but I'll show you why it's important that rheumatologists need to get involved with these patients, give them early immunosuppression, and it should not be just only dermatologists managing these patients. So you have different types of cutaneous disease. You have the linear, we'll have pictures, linear scleroderma, you have circumscribed morphea, you have generalized morphea, you have mixed presentations, and pansclerotic morphea. And the systemic disease, you have the diffuse cutaneous, the limited cutaneous, and the overlap. So localized scleroderma is one disease that I work along with my dermatologists in managing, and we help with the systemic immunosuppression for these patients. Basically, these are patients who get excessive skin thickening and excessive accumulation of collagen, which can lead to long-term atrophy of the subcutaneous diseases and tissues, which is very disfiguring for these patients. In the very early stages, it can be erythematous, painful lesions. We rarely see patients at that level. We usually see them in the long term, and these localized scleroderma do not have many systemic symptoms. It's mostly what you see locally, but they can have other issues like ipsilateral uveitis in the craniofacial presentations. They can have dental abnormalities. They can have seizures in certain craniofacial types and cosmetic issues. So here are a number of children. The first starting right from the top and going horizontally. So the very first one is circumscribed morphea, but you can see the depressed scar it has left. So there's no point just giving topical therapies for this. They need to have had early systemic therapies. This is deep morphea in the gluteum, and you can see how much of disfiguration has happened. The next child, you can see it's a linear scleroderma coming from across the arm right down to the length of the arm from, across the chest. And you can see how this limb is, you just look at the arm and the forearm, you can see how less developed, how much of less bulk is there in the arm of this child. Here you can see the wastage in one side of the chin, and this is one of the types of the craniofacial morphea. This is a child who has a large gluteal lesion which is extending down to the back of his thigh, and you can see the flexion deformity of his leg and the hip in his stance, that because of the subcutaneous atrophy and other problems that that result from this. Again, this is the classic linear scleroderma, where you have a very long patch crossing joints. Here it has crossed two joints, as you can see, and this can lead to a lot of difference between, look at this child, you can see the difference in the bulk between the two limbs. You can see the flexion contractures that happen in these patients. So it's a very, very disfiguring disease. And you can see here the small toes are all in fixed flexion deformity because of the length of the linear scleroderma lesions that the child has. These are the craniofacial lesions. This is called encoupe de sabre, or the slash of a sabre. It's like a sabre has cut through the face, and you have this very long lesion like that, and you will often get that part getting depressed in the long term. You can see this child, she has, again, this is a kind of encoupe de sabre, though it's not as sharp cut as the other. Here you have a lesion which is widely there on the face, but it extends into the forehead, and you can even see a little depression in the scalp where there's no hair, because that's the thickness to which the disease has involved her skin and subcutaneous tissues, that there is no hair growth there at all. And here you can see under the neck, you can see the defect of localized scleroderma. This, on the extreme one, is a classic Parry-Romberg syndrome, where they have a hemifacial atrophy. This is beyond just disfiguration. These patients can have abnormalities in the brain because of the skull growth being compromised, and they can actually have seizures. The child next to that has a much milder version of this, and these patients should definitely have an MRI to look for such problems. This is generalized morphea, the lesions just everywhere, and this was a child we actually gave tocilizumab to, and we had good results from that. And this is heartrending. Thankfully, I do not have any patients. That is extremely rare, thankfully, disabling pansclerotic morphea. And this is a terrible, terrible condition for the patient, the family, and the doctor. So the thing about, one of the largest studies of juvenile localized scleroderma across multiple centers tells us that linear scleroderma is the commonest presentation we see in children. Plaque morphea comes next, and generalized morphea next, and deep morphea is even lower than that. And the pansclerotic is thankfully extremely rare. They can have other family autoimmunity, and you can be about 42% ANA positive. You can also have other systemic correlations. You can have arthritis with some patients, you can have uveitis, you can have other autoimmune conditions too in some of these patients. And the recommendations for care is, ideally it's recommended you can make the diagnosis clinically. You don't actually need a biopsy. Many of the cases I showed are very, very typical. You do not need a biopsy for those patients, but there are some patients where, if it's atypical, they do recommend you do a biopsy. Generally, I find dermatologists like to do biopsy before they send the patient to you, and so this is a conversation we need to be having with them. We do look for autoantibodies. If ANA is negative, I don't bother to do ANA profile for these patients. And then in certain cases, you don't need to do screening for cardiopulmonary involvement in all of them unless there are specific reasons to do so. But when you have craniofacial lesions, they do suggest thinking about a brain MRI with contrast, uveitis screen, or dental assessment as part of the evaluation for these patients. And treatment-wise, unless you have a very small, circumscribed, superficial, non-progressive morphia, all other types require systemic immunosuppression. PUVA therapy is not beneficial to these patients. And when we say systemic immunosuppression, we use methotrexate is our first line, and you use good doses of it. And like Elizabeth was describing in the morning, and we use bridge therapy with corticosteroids for 3 months till methotrexate establishes its effect. And some patients, if you don't get adequate effect on that, you can change them to other drugs. And one of the most popular is mycophenolate mofetil for these patients. And how do you monitor improvement? Serial photographs are what I use. If you have already available tools like body maps, very good. If you can have thermography available to you, that's a very useful test. We don't have it available to us. MRIs and things are very difficult. There are skin scores that can be used. The localized scleroderma assessment tool, I think Singapore is quite familiar with this. And prognosis-wise, we have to remember that many of these conditions, it's not a serious life-threatening condition for most of these patients, but it is a potentially disfiguring one. So that's why it's important that we take care of them as early as we can. Moving on to systemic scleroderma, the first thing we need to know is that compared to all the other autoimmune diseases we've seen so far, this disease has more than just autoimmunity. So there's inflammation, there's autoimmunity, there's vascular injury, and there is fibroblast activation. This is the triad that actually causes the pathology in these patients. And there are two clinical syndromes to know here mostly. One is the limited scleroderma, or the CREST syndrome, and then you have the progressive systemic sclerosis. The CREST syndrome is an acronym for calcinosis, Raynaud's, esophageal dysmotility, sclerodactyly, and telangiectasias. And both of these are differentiated by the antibody that predominates. So for limited scleroderma, it's anticentromere, and for the progressive systemic sclerosis, it's the anti-SCL70 that you see mostly. So how do these patients present? I think the first important thing is what is the difference between diffuse and limited. In all patients of systemic scleroderma, you need to be having skin thickening proximal to the metacarpophalangeal joints. But in limited scleroderma, that skin thickening is limited to the distal extremities, so does not extend beyond the elbows or the knees. But in diffuse scleroderma, it extends proximal to the elbows and the knees. And this is one child that you can see with diffuse scleroderma. And here you have the early phase, it looks like this, puffy fingers. But then in the late phase, you actually have thickened skin, loss of elasticity, acrosclerosis, and digital tip ulcers. You can have calcinosis, and you have shortening of phalanges. And here you can see, I don't know how well you can see in this picture, you can actually see calcinotic lesions at the, the proximal PIP joints in a couple of places. And this is probably a child with overlap because there are some features of dermatomyositis also. And you can see, when she opens her hands out, you can see bits of Raynaud's phenomenon happening at the tips of the fingers. And then the facies, the scleroderma facies, which is basically very tight skin of the face, a pinched nose, thin pursed lips, small mouth, restricted mouth opening, prominent teeth, and lack of expression on the face. It's a very distinctive face that you can pick out anywhere. And then they go into the atrophy phase where they develop skin atrophy, thin veins, etc., telangiectasias, etc. This is the hand showing the digital tip ulcer. And again, you have the sclerodactyly. And here also you have ulcers here on the PIPs, and this is calcinosis at pressure points. And sometimes you get skin involvement like this because of poor circulation, ischemia that happens. And again, nail fold capilloscopy is very, very useful in these patients. You get initially tortuous dilated capillaries and progressively capillary dropout and atrophic changes, which tells you what the process is going on in these patients. The difference between adult and pediatric, again, very rare condition in children, commoner in adult patients. And while in adults, in children actually we tend to see progressive systemic sclerosis more commonly, but the other things like ILD and PAH are less common in children compared to adults. Scleroderma renal crisis is hardly ever seen in children. That's a great thing. And again, antibody positivity depends on the clinical syndrome that you're seeing. Overall, the survival also is better in children than in adults when the disease starts as a child or as an adult. And again, there are classification criteria which would be too detailed to go into. They exist. They're very useful to refer to when you have a patient to decide how to go ahead with your diagnosis. Treatment-wise, you have general measures and specific measures. So general measures are very, very important. Skin care is extremely important. GI protection, because GI vasculopathy, GI dysmotility are major issues in these patients. So prokinetic agents, antacids, rotating antibiotics for malabsorption. As I told you, this is a disease which has more than just autoimmune pathology and vasculopathy. It also has a progressive fibrosis of all the systems inside. So, they literally harden up over time, and you get a lot of consequences due to that. And that's why they can have malabsorption, they can have dysmotility issues at different levels of the gut. They have Raynaud's phenomenon, for which vasodilators help, and then physical therapy for the tendinitis is important. What about immunosuppression? Steroids help for arthritis and myositis, not so much for the skin disease. Mycophenolate is extremely useful for the skin, or even methotrexate. These days we are not worried about methotrexate causing pulmonary fibrosis, so you can use methotrexate in the earlier stages of the disease. But if they have lung and cardiac, the inflammatory phase of the disease, then we use major immunosuppressors, mycophenolate, cyclophosphamide, rituximab, etc., according to the extent. Antifibrotic therapies to be considered, and as if they have renal crisis, ACE inhibitors. So here we have this 12-year-old girl, and she has fever for more than 3 months. You can see again very puffy fingers with arthritic symptoms, possible history of Raynaud's, but you can't see that here because of her nail polish, beautifully applied. And she also presented with a PUO and had a lymph node biopsy showing necrotizing lymphadenitis. She has anemia, she is DCT positive, so there are some autoantibody features here. She has a 3+ positive ANA. We get 3+, 2+, which is like 1 in 321 and 640 kind of equivalence. And her profile showed an U1RNP with a very mild PMSEL. And this is the phenotype of what we call mixed connective tissue disease. And the important thing about these patients is some of them can have pulmonary hypertension, which can lead to poor prognosis. They can have Raynaud's phenomenon, which can have its own consequences. Okay? So this is how MCTD looks like. There are many diagnostic criteria for MCTD. Again, we're not going to go into the details, but all these features are taken in, so it's a mix. The U1RNP is the antibody that is basically involved with this particular condition, and we recently, from multiple centers in India, we published our series of MCTD patients. We had 31 patients from 11 centers, so it's not a common condition. And what we found that they presented with arthritis, malar rash, and Raynaud's phenomenon in the majority, and we had only 2 deaths in this group, one was due to macrophage activation, one due to sepsis. So what about this? This girl came to me about 2 months back, and she was being treated by alternative medicine for arthritic symptoms and the skin rash. This is a closer view. You can see a lot of flat macular reddish lesions, and this is what we call stasis or hyperglobinemic purpura. And the other feature she's had these skin lesions for 2 years. She's had inflammatory arthritis, particularly small joints. She's noted to be rheumatoid factor positive. She's multiple dental caries. She's failing to thrive. She has recurrent parotitis. When we examined her a bit more, we noticed she has dry eyes. She has very low, many of her electrolytes were low. She has a significant hyperglobulinemia, and a very strong positive ANA with SSA and SSB positive. And this is primary Sjogren's syndrome in children. Secondary Sjogren's, especially secondary to lupus, is far more common than primary Sjogren's. And this is the way they present. And this is, again, there are a lot of, we have the pediatric Sjogren's criteria came out in 2015 or 2016. Previously, it was all the adult Sjogren's criteria, which are not helpful to the pediatric population, because what predominates in children is recurrent parotitis, recurrent conjunctivitis. They can present as a PUO, they can present as hypokalemic paralysis, ocular dryness, etc. They can present as leukopenia with elevated ESR, renal tubular acidosis, etc. And so you need to have the classic, very strong criteria for ocular dryness, very strong criteria for the parotid involvement may not be manifest in the pediatric age group. And they may require a little bit of, modification for us to be able to identify these patients better. And so it was felt that the adult criteria were poorly performing in children with this disease, and that's why the pediatric criteria came up. And they noticed that, interestingly, though recurrent parotitis is a very common presentation of Sjogren's, what they found is if you had absence of parotitis, you actually had more organ damage in these children. But then some children develop neurological, nephrological manifestations and also presented with PUO and lymphadenopathy. I think I have about 5 or 6 children with primary Sjogren's, so it's not really a very, very, very common condition. And just to look at antibodies, so everyone gets excited about ANA positivity, but to make sense out of ANA, there are diseases in which ANA is necessary for making a diagnosis, that's SLE and systemic scleroderma. Diseases in which ANA is helpful in making a diagnosis, so dermatomyositis and Sjogren's. Diseases where it determines prognosis, so JIA uveitis, primary Raynaud's phenomenon, it may tell you that CTD is likely to evolve compared to, in cold climates, just having temperature-induced Raynaud's. And diseases in which ANA is part of the diagnostic criteria, SLE, autoimmune hepatitis, drug-induced lupus, and mixed connective tissue disease. Again, there are many scenarios in which ANA is tested where it is neither helpful for diagnosis nor prognosis or monitoring. So really it is our clinical pre-test probability of this disease being there that is going to tell you more about whether an ANA is relevant or not. So just an ANA positivity does not make a diagnosis of lupus or a connective tissue disease. You need to have many other features like the various criteria that we've gone through during the talk today. And again, I think we look at the secondary ENAs and they're different in different subgroups. We can possibly go off this. And this is how the different ANA patterns look like. So speckled, you have fine and coarse speckled, homogeneous, mixed patterns, nuclear, centromere, and peripheral patterns. So to conclude, CTDs have a very varied presentation. There are a lot of differences from the adult disease, though there are some similarities too. That's why it's very important to know how pediatric disease is present. And awareness of these diseases will increase the thinking about them. Early diagnosis, early referral, and early treatment with standard of care can reduce sequelae, damage, or death. And that, I think, is a situation that all of you are in now, and my apologies for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Balan, for that very informative and excellent lecture. Now it's time, please remain on stage. It's time for questions from the floor. Any questions for Professor Balan?
Yes, Sumaira has written that she has thoroughly enjoyed your lecture, so did I. It's about JDM. When I also had to do a presentation, I also read thoroughly about it, and So what we can do, and as you said, now the phenotype is matched with the myostatin specific antibody. So unfortunately, I did a very thorough search. In Sri Lanka, it is not possible, even in the research laboratories for the moment. So when I talked to an eminent immunologist that we have, what she told was the furthest we can go is you can look at the ANA patterns and just match and predict what myostatin specific antibodies that are possible. I don't know. It's another next step for us. Maybe take many more years to come. So what therapeutic bearing actually that has? Does it have in management? The exactly knowing the myostatin specific antibody to the pinpoint.
So it really helps you prognosticate. It helps you know what the problems for this patient
Anticipate.
are going to be. For instance, an anti-MDA5.
Oh.
You will be very, very careful because these patients may be asymptomatic towards the lung disease, similar to systemic scleroderma. The lung disease can be asymptomatic in children. We saw that beautiful video that Liz showed us in the morning about a little baby who was having so many joints involved, but she's doing all her activities. Similarly, children may naturally restrict activity, but they may not complain about symptoms from lung disease. So if you have an anti-MDA5, for instance, you have to be very vigilant. You have to sometimes do a CT chest in these patients early to look for evidence of lung disease and be very aggressive in the way you treat them. Similarly with NXP2, then you want to treat them aggressively to avoid the contractures, to avoid the calcinosis as far as you can. So there are different things that you look out for in different patients. And if you see the bottom line of each of my phenotypes, I have put what the ANA-IF pattern looks like.
Yeah.
It's not specific though. I mean, possibly you need to convince your government that it's really important to get this test.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Mainly to anticipate what problems that we can have and to monitor vigorously.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a second question if I'm
And one more reason,
Yeah.
say you have a child, we've had this situation, a young child with a rapidly progressive ILD. And maybe they don't have any cutaneous features of dermatomyositis. And you can see that situation with anti-MDA5. Things can progress very fast. There, this test is going to actually give you a good clue and give you the indication to start immunosuppression for this patient, which you may not do so aggressively otherwise. So there are many reasons like that.
Yeah. I have another experience to share. It's about this calcinosis. I have already shared that with the APLA, in one of the APLA webinars. We tried many agents. This child had aggressive disease. We treated it with cyclophosphamide and then rituximab. He was very well managed. 3-4 years into the illness, when there was no myositis, no skin manifestations, it suddenly came from nowhere. The whole of his musculature was precipitated with calcium. I don't know where it came from. Just in one visit, the child could not straighten the lower limb and so on. So trying many things, and last APLA I had a discussion with Liz also, and then tried infliximab at the end, which started resolving the problem. And before that I tried actually cyclophosphamide for a second time. First time I tried it with acute illness, and then years later I tried 6 cycles, and then I thought I can't give it anymore, and then gave infliximab. Unfortunately, he developed allergic reactions to infliximab, and then we had to desensitize and give it further, but still it works. It's worth desensitizing in the ICU, go step by step, little dose increments and so on. But it really got dissolved, and it's still going down. I'm trying infliximab and adalimumab when it is available. So that's the problem.
I don't know. I really don't know the answer to your question. This, as I showed you there, literally everything has been tried in these patients. Some things work in some patients. So patients in whom bisphosphonates work. There are like IV pamidronate or oral alendronate perhaps. And in some patients, anti-TNFs work. We have a series of 9 patients where we've given tofacitinib, and in a good number of them, it took a while. It took more than 9 months overall. In a few patients, little earlier, but overall about 9 months to start seeing change. But they did well. They did well with that. There is some evidence towards type 1 interferon signatures driving the calcinotic process. So that there could be a pathogenic mechanism there. We don't know. But the real thing you know about calcinosis is it's much better to prevent it than to get it. Very likely your patient came to you late in the disease, though you were very aggressive with the treatment, and it's the initial phase of disease where it was not treated, where the bed for calcinosis was laid down.
No, it is not. He presented acutely, and we saw. So I'm surprised. Yeah, he was very well controlled, and he didn't have any myositis for years, and then this came. It's
Very sad.
Yeah,
Very sad.
very sad.
Very sad. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Yes. Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. To my mind, concerning balancing this radiation from high HRCC and having a dramatic environment of plants, how do you see?
So I think we do use HRCT if we have a strong suspicion of interstitial lung disease. They would go by PFTs, DLCO. Chest X-rays are not very sensitive in picking up the findings, but if there was concern from these points, then we would go for a HRCT. And you do have to understand it, understand the risk of radiation, and do it. There is no better test actually, unfortunately.
In adults, we do routinely we have to do an HRCT. We are scleroderma, you will do an HRCT.
Yes.
My question is,
Yes, in scleroderma definitely. In scleroderma for sure. In JDM, depending, if I had an anti-MDF5 for sure, if I had an anti-synthetase, or if I had a overlap kind of myositis, my pulmonologist would actually, for those patients. For an NXP2 with normal PFTs and DLCO, etc., we may not. Actually.
Any other questions from the floor?
Thank you very much. I know it's a very tedious topic and so many different elements to throw in at the same time. I hope it was effective.
Professor Balan, I have one question. I'm no pediatric rheumatologist, but in juvenile dermatomyositis, instead of MRI, especially in countries like ours, this ultrasound scan have a place.
Yes, if you have a skilled ultrasound person who can make out the changes on ultrasound, high definition ultrasound is an option if you have the right person who can do it. Right. Ultrasound is a tool in the hands of the observer.
Yeah.
So if you have the skill, then yes, it is an option.
Okay, thank you very much again. So we finished this session for today, and tomorrow we start here at 8:30 a.m. Thank you.